tragedy that doesn't entail sacrifice, heroics, or at least inevitable sacrifice, the necessity of sacrifice, heroics, a kind of violence, a kind of sublime, and the fact that Carsten just brought up the Heritage Labels, although Höhler has this a legacy of attachment to all of these ideas that I just mentioned, and they appear in all of his actual discussions of tragedy, I think there is in his work, but also in other possible sources, a different way of conceiving of tragedy that doesn't entail commitment to those, and doesn't necessarily entail commitment to redemption either. Nor does it entail commitment to a telos. So there is certainly a dominant model of tragedy which needs all those things, but there are other possible articulations of tragedy, even in a tragedian sense, which, to use your formulation, Stephen, is a sort of synaptic transformation of suffering into some kind of knowledge. It's a giving form. In that context, I'm thinking again over and over about the question that's been raised today about whether we live in tragic times, and I can't let go of that question because I'm thinking, what if we don't? What is left? Suffering isn't going to be gone, and I don't mean to dismiss the idea that we should work to eradicate unnecessary suffering, but there will be suffering. But what will be left? Raw pain, distraction, and sadism. And to me, when I'm starting to think, what's the opposite of tragedy now? It's not comedy in our age, it's sadism.
There were a couple of people.
Charles had his hand up for quite a while.
First a footnote. I think if you read Karen Painter's essay, you'll see that a good deal of it is about the way music is used for private, coming to terms with private grief despite the strictures of the regime and all that's in play. But my question is, well, this is probably a really crude question. Millions of Germans every week heard a tale of sacrifice. They went to church. They listened to the gospel. Jesus' sacrifice. This is far more often dealt with this story over and over again than dealt with Rosen or even Wagner or others. And it doesn't have the same, in our secular age, the same canonic value, but I think it's important. And I don't know whether that's I don't think they hear it as a tragedy. I think, I think sacrifice and tragedy are things that can come together, but I'm sympathetic with the last comment. I don't think they're bound at the hip in a certain sense. I'm not sure what sacrifice is usually, as somebody said earlier, sacrifice for. Soldiers have sacrificed their lives for fatherland, and we don't think we don't always apply the word tragic to that type of sacrifice. We don't, American history is Iwo Jima, it's tragic. We see these as sort of perhaps intersecting dimensions. So I think what tragedy involves is, I don't think we can, we have to ask what is the impact, what is the lesson for the spectator. It seems to me the spectator is crucial in all this, using a church congregation as spectators for the Gospels. And it summons to us to be transformed in some way, I think. Not necessarily democratized, but to think about responsibility, freedom, choice, and this is, so I think this is just somehow crucial that we have to identify the audience, there are the characters, there's the chorus, and then there's the spectators. And these things in the tragedy are really one bound up together.
Helmut, then Jim, and then Wolfgang.
I don't quite know how to put this, but I think it does speak to this question of who are the spectators and how do you mediate identification with tragic figures. There's an infamous quotation from Joseph Stalin where he says, "Death of an individual is tragic, but the death of a million is a statistic." And you raised this question last night about how it is that statistics, we call them, naked statistics, but they have no mediating quality whatsoever. I mean, that's not quite true, but generally speaking, it is true. And I was thinking about this in terms of this earlier comment about how, yours, Mark, about how the ending allows us or doesn't allow us to actually identify or have a sort of sympathy with the person being sacrificed. Because when we do talk about these great historical events, war as paradigmatic, we are talking about sacrifice. I mean, the German word Opfer works in both ways. It's the government appeals to people, soldiers, and we think about them also in terms of those who have been killed, and that's a kind of a double word. So I think that one thing that might be useful to think about as we think about the tragic is the mediation of a kind of sympathetic or empathetic identification with
First, Jim, I mean, that you addressed that in some level, yeah.
No, that's it's all very, very helpful. I just actually wanted to clarify that I wasn't by any means suggesting that tragedy and sacrifice are identical or even necessarily linked. It seems to me that this notion of tragedy, of sacrifice, that is in some sense implicit, I think, more in the notion of redemption that shows up, is a danger that tragedy is exposed to, so to speak, a kind of distortion that it's open to. When we speak about on what behalf is sacrificed, this takes us, in that sense, to the political mobilization of tragedy. If tragedy is seen as redemptive sacrifice, then it's on behalf of a national character or something like that. That would be the kind of thing that would be dangerous. But I'm not, for Walter Benjamin, as you pointed out, and this is important to recognize, Greek tragedy he understands as a suspension of sacrifice. It's the invocation of sacrifice and the simultaneous suspension of it prior to the, if you will, Christian culmination of the perfect sacrifice that would eliminate death. This is a kind of suspension of the sacrificial moment within death. And it's that he's, I think, mobilizing against a rhetoric of redemption and sacrifice that has been tied to the tragic at this point. So I'm not suggesting that the tragic is, I take your point, absolutely. It's not inextricably bound to sacrifice. It's just that it's exposed to that danger.
No, first of all,
Ich würde gerne noch einmal auf das zurückkommen, was Jennifer gefragt hat. Also auf die Frage, ob wir in einer Situation leben, die Tragödie möglich macht. Ich glaube nicht. Und ich glaube, dass tatsächlich die Unterscheidung, die Benjamin macht, zwischen Tragödie und Trauerspiel, eine ist, die auch jetzt greift. Das Trauerspiel ist ja eine Form, er skizziert das, er zeigt das eben am deutschen barocken Trauerspiel des 17. Jahrhunderts, die zusammenhängt mit großen historischen Katastrophen. In dem Falle dem Dreißigjährigen Krieg. Und das, was in den Trauerspielen kommt eine Geschichtsauffassung durch, die vollkommen resignativ ist. Benjamin sagt ja, ein Trauerspiel ist ein Spiel vor Traurigen. Es ist ein Spiel, das traurig macht. Es ist nicht ein Spiel, das erlöst. Es ist nicht ein Spiel, das eine Art von Katharsis gewährt, sondern es ist ein Spiel, was traurig macht. Warum macht es traurig? Es macht traurig, weil es nichts verspricht, weil es einfach nur zeigt, die Geschichte sozusagen dreht sich im Kreis, die Geschichte geht immer weiter, es wird immer wieder Opfer geben, es gibt aber keinen Fortschritt, nichts, was herausführt, keinen Ausblick auf eine Zukunft, die irgendwie anders beschaffen wäre als die Gegenwart. Jan Kott, der polnische Theaterwissenschaftler, der hat das mal angesichts der Historien von Shakespeare in ein wunderbares Bild gefasst. Er hat gesagt, wenn man mal alle Historien von Shakespeare hintereinander weg in einem Zug liest, dann verwischen sich die Figuren. Es gibt immer einen Will, es gibt immer einen Henry, es gibt immer einen Richard. Und man weiß irgendwann nicht mehr, wer in welches Stück gehört. Diese Figuren treten auf der historischen Bühne auf, sie steigen, sie fallen, es kommen die Nächsten. Und es gibt überhaupt keine Aussicht darauf, dass sich an diesem Prozess etwas Grundsätzliches ändert. Und ich glaube, das ist die Quintessenz des Trauerspiels. Und sie ist, glaube ich, wirklich ganz scharf zu unterscheiden von dem, was in der Tragödie passiert, die in irgendeiner Weise immer mit Aufklärung, mit Verantwortung, mit menschlicher Verantwortung, mit Entscheidungen, mit diesen Dingen wie immer problematisch verbunden ist. Ich halte nur sozusagen einen Punkt für problematisch bei Benjamin, nämlich diese starre geschichtsphilosophische Unterscheidung. Wenn er sagt, die Tragödie gehört nur in die Antike und das Trauerspiel gehört nur ins Barock und dann in die Zeit danach. Ich denke, es gibt unter Umständen Mischformen, und es gibt historische Situationen, in denen so etwas wie ein Revival der Tragödie als einer authentischen Form durchaus möglich ist. Aber ich glaube im Grunde jetzt, ja, wenn man jemanden auf der Straße fragt, glauben Sie, dass unsere Gesellschaft, dass das einfach so weitergeht, wie wir es jetzt machen, die nächsten 50, 60, 80, 100 Jahre, und dass es nicht nur weitergeht, sondern dass es immer besser wird, dass es allen Menschen immer besser geht, da werden wahrscheinlich die wenigsten Leute sagen, ja, das glaube ich, sondern viele werden sagen, naja, irgendetwas stimmt nicht, ob das nun der ökologische Aspekt ist oder ob es einfach die globalen Konflikte sind, die eher mehr werden als weniger werden, ob es die wirtschaftlichen Krisen sind, die eher häufiger werden als seltener werden. Es gibt sozusagen so ein ungutes Gefühl des geschichtlichen Gesamtverlaufes, was viele sich nicht eingestehen, was aber, glaube ich, schon irgendwie vorhanden ist. Und deswegen würde ich sagen, es ist kein Zeitalter von Aufklärung, es ist deswegen auch kein Zeitalter von Tragödie, sondern wenn es sozusagen überhaupt noch eine Form gibt, die dem entsprechen könnte, die etwas Authentisches davon wiedergeben könnte. Und das Trauerspiel ist nicht schlechter als die Tragödie. Es ist die authentische Ausdrucksform einer bestimmten historischen Situation, dann ist es das Trauerspiel.
Not just to answer that in one sentence, I would only say that in the comment that I was making, I specifically talked about sublime. Sorry, I spoke about the sublime and violence and sacrifice being necessary. Maybe there is another way to think of tragedy outside of that. There may also be another way to think of tragedy outside of Aufklärung. And I think that there is a kind of tragedy of loss, of ineffable loss that still inches toward an attempt to turn suffering into something understandable or something we can cope with. So I agree with you, except I don't think there are just the two Benjamin options.
I think now we have quite a few. Jeff is next one, then Carsten, and then Klaus.
Sabine is back.
Yeah, I already have her.
I wanted to bring together Helmut's point with Jennifer's point about if we don't live in tragic times, we're either faced with suffering or sadism or what was the other one? Distraction. I wonder if that's true. Is that because we no longer live in I'm going to be simplistically general here, I know. But if we don't, it seems to me sometimes like we don't live in a time where any of us consider ourselves to be spectators. That there's precisely no mediation. There have been studies done that suggest that every demographic considers itself to be a victim. If the Koch brothers consider themselves to be a victim, or like, even aside from the rhetoric, right? If the wealthiest 1% consider themselves to be victims, we now no longer have, and the only way to produce an effect that would be the analog of something like pity or fear is precisely distraction or sadism, then it's because we're no longer spectators. I'm wondering if that's connected with what you're talking about.
Carsten, I think.
Well, I want to make two brief comments. One about Trauerspiel. I think we'll probably say more about the Trauerspiel later, so I don't want to say much. I think that'll come up again. But I think we have to distinguish the barocke Trauerspiel, which das hat einen religiösen Hintergrund. There's a religious background. It has, I mean, take something like Rufus Carolus Dualis or so. He's a martyr. He's presented by Gryphius. These plays don't make sense without the religious background. And we have to distinguish these plays from, let's say, some short stories or plays by Kleist, where this is not present. So I think the Trauerspiel is a category which needs to be broken down and looked at much more carefully. But that's all I wanted to talk really about sacrifice here, which we began with. And about sacrifice, I think we should, sacrifice presupposes a telos. That telos can be one we endorse and take seriously, and it can be one which we disapprove of. That's a very important distinction, I think. I think it may be, especially given your comment, that the real tragedy, especially German tragedy, is the person who does sacrifice himself for a telos, which we recognize to be vain. That's a tragedy very different from the one where we endorse the telos and sort of in Hegelian fashion draw some edifying lesson from. The tragedy has a totally different quality. And then there is a third tragedy where we don't believe, where the notion of telos doesn't enter at all, and then there is no sacrifice either. There's just destruction. Yeah, so I think you can distinguish now, there are tragedies in all three senses, I think, and we can give examples.
Do you want to respond to this, Jim, or?
Just brief, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that we want to use this notion of sacrifice to make the notion of tragedy more complicated, and to see the different relationships that it has. Part of what's in the background of what I'm saying is just our meeting here has to do with, has this adjective that we haven't really discussed that much of Deutsch. It's there, you know. Deutsche Tage, and in what sense when we collate, and this is not unusual to collate this notion of tragedy with some kind of national identity, there, I think we want to make sure that we see there are other and better ways of coordinating these.
So we have Klaus. Yeah.
I just want to remark that in my opinion the religious frame of the Baroque Trauerspiel is a very desperate one. So, and there is, I think this can be shown in the plays of Gryphius and of Lohenstein, nearly nihilistic undercurrent of these plays.
Klaus, and then Sabine, and then Sylvia, and then I have you all down, but it takes a long list. Klaus.
I wanted to pick up on the question of sacrifice and Jennifer's contention about sort of sadism or perversion, and also the question of suffering that has been brought up. Isn't to a certain degree tragedy very much a compensatory mechanism? That it always, and I would second your idea, that there's always some residual secondary gain or enjoyment in suffering. Where to a certain degree, right, the weakness is again turned into some form of strength. And I think that that the idea of sacrifice very much speaks that. And one cannot get away from the goat being sacrificed here. There is an idea of even if it's just in Bataille, he doesn't believe in God, but there's still an externality, an idea of luxury and waste that's joyful in suffering. And I think that it undergirds the tradition of the tragic in a profound sense. And I also think, I mean, just think of perversion. Isn't that perverse that, you know, that we are enjoying, we mentioned that yesterday, the end of fun is still some form of fun, that there is still somebody who enjoys at whose behest we work. And it's not the ego. I mean, when you think of, for example, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, there is no more enjoyment in the repetition compulsion. It's completely drained. Or Nietzsche, who says, you know, what bothers us the most is senseless suffering. And I think the rebirth of tragedy seems to be a project that tries to drain to the utmost degree the, let's just call it, sorry for the neologism, tragedy, the salvation machinery inherent in the tragic scheme, so to say. And the Trauerspiel is a case in point. I mean, in Critique of Violence, that moment when Benjamin says, mythical violence demands sacrifice, and I know he doesn't associate tragedy with mythical violence, to the contrary, but then divine violence accepts it. And I've been wondering all my life so far what accepting and das Opfer annehmen would mean, as contrary to that compensatory vestige of the sacrifice.
Yeah.
I'm a lot more comfortable with what Lisa said last night also about the work, the harder work going into comedy. And I'm thinking of Dürrenmatt saying, unsere Zeit ist nur mit der Komödie beizukommen, something like that, right? Where he basically sees comedy as the way to grasp the issues of the day. And I'm thinking of a film like Life is Beautiful that I thought of as I listened to your mother's poem, which, you know, sort of really stands in tension with that, Der schöne Tag. And at the same time, that Mel Brooks is the producers, right? Which as a German, and you watch it as a German, it sort of makes you very uncomfortable in certain parts. I remember watching it on Broadway, and really, you know, I'm sitting there, everyone is laughing out loud, and it sort of, you know, makes me freeze on the inside with it. It's very odd. But I'm also thinking of the fact that in this country, the only news you can take seriously is The Daily Show. Which is very strange, you know, that it's as if we can only get at the mess we're in through comedy.
I think I would like to shift tack for a second. It sort of stays with some of the topics, but I think what really irked me was the word sadism, and so I thought, sometimes the death is not physical but psychological. It's almost with emotion, there's a death of reason. And so how do you deal with that? Maybe we are more living in an insane time rather than a tragic time. And then when you look at the etymology of Wahnsinn, you know, you can read it as hope against hope, which is either totally cynical or very idealistically. And so I thought of, you know, one of the, you know, Jeffrey ends his essay with the scream. Karsten talks about the scream. No word, no sound even. It's very much this open-mouthed distortion, which does look insane. And then I thought of Anna O, right? Anna O, who could not talk, who could not move, and who ultimately, after going through the Sprechkur, actually became Wachter von Pappenheim, who worked with, you know, or worked against white slavery. So there is this moment of getting beyond the insane through, and here I come back maybe to my little pet peeve, you know, that it has to be hard, it has to be worked in language, just the way Anna O had to work through it. And so I think sadism, I don't think, maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I'd rather go with insanity.
I just wanted to make a very small remark. I found Jeffrey's point interesting, saying that there is no audience, and it's really, I think, worth to talk about the audience. And yesterday I mentioned the inflation of autobiography, so the increasing talk about ourselves. So, you know, if there's nobody you know, you don't have an audience, but if everybody talks about themselves, who is going to listen, and who is going to watch, and who is going to correspond, who is going to be the chorus, and to comment. And it seems that there is an inflation of self-comment. And then there's another point, I mean, being a writer, you know, you keep asking, do we live in tragic times? And you keep asking for forms. And if I look at the book, I mean, there's one thing we haven't talked about contemporary literature yet. We talk about Gryphius, we talk about the Trauerspiel, and if we start talking about, let's say, German theater of the 21st century, of course we would have to go to the theater and have a look at the plays. So what's really going on there? And so if we read what there is and if we watch what there is, we might get an answer to many questions that were raised here. Because I think many people who bring plays on stage, they don't bother with the question, is it tragic, is it not tragic, and they just bring things on stage. Like last Sunday I went to the Elfriede Jelinek Rheingold, which comes well with the Nibelungen-Lied, and I was wondering what's going on stage. I mean, I didn't really appreciate what I saw. It was of good quality, but it was definitely not tragedy. What was it? I don't know. And it would have been interesting to talk to the, perhaps, I don't know. But so the point is, the answer lies in the art. So we have to see what's going on. And you can't apply theory on the arts. I mean, it doesn't help to go, let's see, to a director and say, you know, why don't you work a little bit harder on tragedy, because it would be terrible if we didn't have any tragedy anymore. And I think that's a very, very interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this question that's been raised several times about tragedy in our age. I like what Wolfram said very much about the Trauerspiel Tragödie distinction and the way things look in modernity. And I was late, my plane was late, so I didn't hear Felicitas talk about comedy, but I share to some degree what is. Oh, okay, but it came up a couple times that perhaps we live in an age of comedy, and therefore we have a lot of parody of tragedy, which fits very nicely into comedy already with Aristophanes. But when Dürrenmatt says that tragedy is not possible, his main argument seems to be that we no longer have a single individual who can change society. You no longer have that great individual in a simple world who can make things happen. Everything is interconnected in a certain way. I want to take this argument and turn it on its head and suggest that one of the most interesting ethical books of recent decades is Hans Jonas's The Imperative of Responsibility. And in this book, he talks about Fernwirkungen, the distant effects of our action. Precisely because we are so connected, our actions do have a ripple effect that can lead to consequences beyond our horizon. And that makes us more responsible in a certain sense. The argument Dürrenmatt gives against tragedy could actually be an argument for responsibility, which is a criterion for tragedy. And the last point I want to make is there is a presupposition in what Wolfram said, and I think in some of the other comments made earlier, and that is when we say that we don't live in an age where tragedy is possible because you simply need to find out what people are thinking, they don't have a view that would transcend a negative horizon, we are suggesting that art should be mimetic. It should, in a way, imitate what exists. And I think that is a limiting conception of art. Why not think of art as precisely countercultural? It's a view that I think leads to problems in Adorno as well. Art needs to reflect the problems of its age. It cannot offer a counter-image, a countercultural form. And someone who I think, come back to the last point to Felicitas' comment, I'm not an expert on the contemporary German stage, but one of the interesting aspects of tragedy is how it's migrated to film. Some of us were talking about it during the break. And even American film, certainly Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, is an example of tragedy. But what makes Eastwood even more interesting in recent years is, I think, a work like Gran Torino, which is not even tragic, but it is a drama of reconciliation, because it goes beyond the tragic, and that's very countercultural. He's not presenting what is, he's presenting what should be. And in a certain sense, Aristotle was wrong when he talks about Antigone and says she's just a little bit above us. Sophocles was presenting something that was not mimetic. Antigone is an imitation not of reality, but of the higher forms, as Plato would say later on. And art should give us, and part of its repertoire, perhaps works that are countercultural, that are completely against the age, that would speak for the need for tragedy and even other forms.
Now we have first Joe, then let me just read it, Jack, Jim, and Josh. I did this on purpose.
It's a whole strand of J's there.
Exactly.
But in any event, I would also like to say a word in behalf of the countercultural. I mean, it always bothers me when we talk as if the only option we ever have is to somehow embrace the spirit of the times. If we don't embrace the spirit of the times, then we can't be heard. But it seems that we really have to challenge the times. And what I wanted to say was something with regard to how I hear the word German in the German tragic. Right? First of all, general problem. I think we can all agree that the democratization political democratization is a good thing. And at the same time, many of us seem to think that the democratization of culture, on the other hand, is kind of a bad thing. And that's a problem we're supposed to negotiate. And to talk of democratization in general is to be reminded of the significant contributions of France and England to the modern world. France gave us equality in politics, and England gave us the Industrial Revolution and a whole lot of nifty stuff. And the Germans were always talking as if they were going to give us something very significant too. It was going to be, I mean, from Goethe, I think of Schelling's Berlin lectures, I think of Nietzsche and Heidegger, and I think of Nietzsche bringing it all together. What the Germans were going to give us is depth. They were going to give us the possibility of tragic vision. That's what they were going to give us. And what we ended up instead was first Nazis who were saying that music should be all patriotic and should make us feel good, and we should depict everyone as blonde and beautiful and happy, and so forth and so on. And that ended in a colossal failure. And then the segue was to an American culture that in many regards wasn't that much different. I mean, in the sense that we like to feel good about ourselves, and it's sort of the American thing to deny tragedy. And so when I hear the German, think of the specifically German moment. What is the German tragedy at play here? Well, it seems that that would have been a good thing. That would have been a good thing if Goethe through Schelling to Nietzsche and Heidegger could have given us some sense of real spiritual depth. Right?
Well, there's also
but
Beethoven and Schubert.
It fell apart. We didn't get it. They didn't deliver. I find that tragic.
Only in the side of the Jewish going down, that's where it is.
So I thought I wanted to just respond to Mark, now I want to respond to Joe as well. I think that there's one other thing the Germans gave us, and this ties into one of the problematic aspects, is that after Nazism, we got Habermas, which means deliberative democracy, always talking, no spectators. I wonder if Adorno, since I think he kind of rehearsed an Adornian trajectory in what you were saying, I wonder if Mark's account of Adorno is fully correct. I think that there are problems with Adorno's conception of art in its being tied to the times, given that Adorno, I would say, bases his philosophy in a kind of historicity that would make that problematic. However, it seems to me that his conception of the Bilderverbot is precisely a negative moment that allows for counterculture, right? I mean, was Schoenberg popular when Adorno was writing about Schoenberg? Certainly not as popular as Stravinsky. So there's I think there needs to be a more complex sense in which, and I'm not trying to save Adorno from anything, nor does he need my saving. But I wonder if that kind of a critique of popular culture is itself simply mimetic. Maybe you weren't suggesting that, or maybe you
Well,
were.
I would give a brief response. What Adorno elevates both in Art and the Age is dissonance. And he would view that perhaps as countercultural to a view that doesn't recognize it. But in fact, a lot of what one consider dissonant art has become commodified.
Yes, that's right. So
I'm
now,
not sure he was right in that analysis.
So I think post-haste we can say that and in fact Adorno himself has become commodified. I mean that's also true. But so you mean that
And he
Adorno
certainly did not allow on a meta level for an art that would be other than dissonant, given his analysis of the age is dissonant.
I'm not sure that I agree, but I understand what you're saying better now. Yes.
Jim, and then Jack, and I think then we have to come
And
to
then we stop.
We have to postpone the other points to
Yeah.
tomorrow. Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, Joe, it seems to me that what the Americans have given culture is convenience. That's our great contribution to the history of the universe. But 24/7.
And the internet, where everyone gets to tell their story and no one can hear any stories whatsoever.
We hope the NSA is listening, because otherwise. What I want to recall is that, at least in my understanding of Benjamin, the people who write Baroque Trauerspiels are not trying to write Baroque Trauerspiels. They're trying to write tragedies, and they're Trauerspiels because they're trying to write tragedies. And the danger, it seems to me, of misdiagnosing the aesthetic potential of the times, it's not just this mimetic sense, would be my understanding, but rather that we aim to transcend the times, to produce a tragedy, and it veers off and becomes a horror story, or it veers off and becomes a Trauerspiel, or it veers off and becomes something else, that it's not all within our own intentional power to realize these forms, and that's the danger in misunderstanding our historical situation. And that seems to me that that's part of what Benjamin is trying to understand, that these people were faced with catastrophic historical circumstances and attempted to respond to them by giving them the dignity of tragedy. And in so doing, they revealed the source of the Trauerspiel is Greek tragedy, but its origin is the history that's around it, and that historical circumstance is what comes to light inadvertently and against the intentions of the authors through the limitations, the ruins, the fragmentation that characterizes their attempts at tragedy. And when we do that, I mean, to take Willy Loma, Death of a Salesman, that one could say, and I've heard it argued, yes, the intention that is there is to create a modern, contemporary American tragedy, but what comes out is a melodrama. And that the sentimentality does not reach tragic pathos. And I'm not arguing that, I'm not trying to make an aesthetic claim about that play, but this would be the dynamic that would be involved, it seems to me, in trying to understand the historical conditions that are there. So I'm not just restricting it to a mimetic relation, but saying that the limits are imposed from without, perhaps.
Thanks. I'm going back to this question of whether tragedy is possible, whether we live in a tragic age. And I have two sort of observations about that. One is that it's a historically bounded question. This question didn't make sense before 1800 or so. There wasn't kind of a question of whether it was possible to either to create tragedies or to perceive tragedies. So that I don't know if that says we're in a tragic age or in an untragic age, but
we're moderns. It says
yeah,
we're moderns.
I mean, exactly. But I think this question has to be sort of again understood in relation to this shift that happened in the way that we understand tragedy as being something that is at least a question in society in a way that in sort of Western cultures in which there is a tragic tradition, there was not previously a question of whether tragedy was sort of a live option at that moment. And the second is a sort of genuine uncertainty about what the question means. Does the question mean, is it possible to create tragedies? That is, to create works either that have a formal continuity or a continuity in a certain tragic content with the tragedies of whatever tradition we want to construct? Or, on the other hand, is it possible to view tragedies as tragedies? That is, are we as audiences capable of grasping the tragic in its sort of deepest and richest sense? I heard different ways of understanding that question of the tragic character of modernity or the possibilities of modern tragedy. The one sort of suggestion I would make is that Hegel gives us some way of understanding how we might still be able to think about tragedy without being in a tragic age, and that is the idea of the that is that there may be still a possibility of tragedy, but not a necessity of tragedy, or not a sense of tragedy as being a central feature of our philosophical or artistic life. And that to me actually makes a lot of sense, and maybe that's sort of something to continue thinking about.
We have one more with Barbara, please.
Just a very brief remark. I would say the contemporary German writer who comes closest to all the questions connected to tragedy is Heiner Müller. Did he write tragedy? No. Did he perform tragedies? No. He produced a whole bunch of texts, and they were performed, and most of them, they don't have a title, they don't have a genre, they have nothing that kind of corresponds to the kind of established history of the genre, but the questions are all there. And once he came to printing what he had produced, if you open the books, no titles, there is kind of there are voices, different voices, and then you turn the page, and all of a sudden it's a prose text, like the rewriting of the Alcestis. You turn the page, all of a sudden it's a translation of Shakespeare, and he didn't even have English. So there's obviously a working through the problems of tragedy. There's still a stage, and there's an audience for that, especially before '89, I would say. And it's extremely important what's performed there, what's discussed there, but it's far away from tragedy. So obviously there's a kind of a transformation, and it would be very interesting to try to figure out what kind of a transformation is that's going on there.
Thank you all very much.